This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 339, Smart Date. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about Smart Date with Martin Anderson-Clutz. Martin joined Acquia last year, but before that was with Digital Echidna, now Northern Commerce, for 6.5 years. And has been using Drupal for over 16 years. Wow. He helps to maintain a growing list of contrib modules, one of which we are talking about today, and has spoken at various camps and conferences. Martin lives in London, Ontario, Canada, with his wife, son, cat, and dog. Martin, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks. Great to be here.
I'm just curious, how do the cat and dog get along with each other?
The dog is very distrustful of the cat, and with good reason, because the cat loves to torture him.
Yeah. I'm John Picozzi, and today my co-hosts are, I guess I only have one, Nick Laughlin. How's it going?
Pretty good. How you guys doing? Looking forward to learning more about Smart Date this week.
Yeah, it's gonna be a fun topic. I am also looking forward to it. Before we get to our module of the week and our primary topic, we have a few words from Mike Anello about the Aaron Winborn Award.
Hey now, this is Mike Anello from the Drupal Community Working Group. I've been a longtime member of the Drupal community, username Ultimike. You may have heard me on this very podcast in the past, but I'm here to tell you about the 2022 Aaron Winborn Award nominations, which are now open. So we are looking for nominations from the Drupal community for folks who, quote, demonstrate personal integrity, kindness, and above and beyond commitment to the Drupal community. Each year at DrupalCon North America, we are lucky enough to award this to an individual who demonstrates those qualities, and we are looking for the next winner of the Aaron Winborn Award. So nominations are open until Friday, March 25th of this year, 2022, and the winner, of course, will be announced at DrupalCon North America. So if you know someone who is worthy of this award or just worthy of being nominated, please let us know. I have a nice short link for you. You can go to bit.ly, so that's a bit.ly link, bit.ly/AWA 2022. AWA for Aaron Winborn Award and the year 2022. Once again, bit.ly/AWA 2022. Look forward to seeing your nominations. And thank you very much, Talking Drupal folks.
Mike, thanks. And be sure to get your nominations in. Very important, and a great way to show appreciation for that special Drupal person in your Drupal world. Moving on to the module of the week, let's talk about inline entity forms.
Absolutely. Inline entity forms is a really useful module. It's in use by over 150,000 different sites. Provides a widget for inline management of kind of nested entities. So, pretty commonly, let's say you have an event that references a place, rather than having to make sure that that place is defined beforehand, you can provide a widget that allows somebody to create that place while they're creating the event listing.
I was going to say, I think I've used it quite a bit with Commerce. Commerce allows you to do that. I like how you tied it into date, seeing as we're talking about smart dates today. That was well played.
I was going to say that it also allows you to reference existing entities. So the other really cool thing about it is, in the instance you mentioned, if the place already exists, but you need to update some information, you don't have to go find where that place exists. You can just be on the event and, tweak the phone number, address, or title, or whatever it is that you need to change. So you can also edit existing items.
So I've got a rather beginner question here. Any entity. So could I use it with media? Yes.
You can use it with media. You can use it with custom entities. There's really a variety of different ways you can use it. One of the other things that I think is cool about inline entity form is that it has built-in support for form modes, which I feel like is one of those capabilities within Drupal core that doesn't get a lot of use, but it can be really nice for having a simplified version of that, add or edit form when you're using something inline that way.
That's actually a good point. I think other than Media Library, which kind of pulls it out of the box and uses form display, I think inline entity form is the only time I've ever actually used custom form displays, other than like customizing the default one that the node that the entity creation form is. But yeah, I actually use that on, believe it or not, an event content type. The client has a list of featured speakers, which for a variety of reasons aren't users. They're a content type. And when they create them from the entity creation, the event creation form, they just want to be able to add the person's title and picture, even though there's a bunch of other information that gets stored. So yeah, you'd actually reminded me of a feature that I used, and I actually completely forgot about.
So that, I think, is a perfect segue into our primary topic, which is Smart Date. But I am going to start off, instead of asking what we typically ask with like, hey, what does Smart Date do? I'm going to ask a kind of an overarching Drupal question, Martin, because you obviously know a lot about dates. So I'm curious, why are dates in Drupal so complex?
So I think I would start answering that by saying that I think working with dates and times are just generally very complex. As an example, this past weekend, a lot of us here in North America had to, roll our clocks forward, and that creates, a variety of complexity. There was actually a tweet by Angie Byron over the weekend that went viral because it was talking about how for the next month, international meetings are in chaos because those of us in North America went ahead by 1 hour. In Europe, that'll happen 2 weeks later. A week after that, Australia actually moves back an hour. And then there are a bunch of places in the world that don't move at all. So, trying to keep those kinds of international meetings aligned across all of, some of those teams that work internationally nowadays can get very complicated. You start to roll in things like recurring dates and, a variety of other considerations. And there's a lot of complexity in there. But I think the other thing is that a lot of us are actually used to using tools that do a pretty good job of handling those. So you think about like a Google Calendar, Outlook, Apple Calendar. A lot of them have some fairly rich features built into that. And then, by comparison, something like the core date time and date time range fields that by design are meant to be very simple, the difference between those in terms of the experience of using them becomes pretty glaring.
I think it's interesting too, like you mentioned daylight savings and I think even just without that, time zones themselves just become very complex because you have, you would think that, there's there's 24 hours in a day, you could only have 24 time zones, right? But you have so many, it's just like anything, you have so many exceptions upon exceptions, you have certain states that, or certain boundary states and towns, for example, in the United States that, decide to join a different time zone for whatever reason. And then towns within those counties that decide that they want to be part of the time zone that they should be in. And so even just calculating, what time a particular person should see for something sometimes is just mind-bogglingly complex.
Well, and I think the other thing you can layer on top of that is that even what the ideal way of handling time zones is going to be is very subjective. So, some sites want, because they have authenticated users, to always have it very user-centric and say, show it to the user in their time zone. But others, maybe if it's, let's say, a concert hall, they might want the times to always be in their local time zone, as an example. But it really varies widely depending on sort of the use case that a site is trying to address.
Here enters
Yeah,
the all times local, help text that you see in some places.
Right.
Well, I think that it goes even further than that too, because yeah, like you said, the ideal sometimes is show the time for the user, but I think I've mentioned this on the show before, but I've had situations where, I manage sites where the client is in Los Angeles. I'm on the East Coast, so they're 3 hours behind me, and they have events. They show other events in Los Angeles time because their events at the time were local. So only local people were going to be going there. And occasionally they would ask me to create the events to test something. And so like, okay, this event is going to be at 9 a.m. So I created at 9 a.m. and Drupal, knowing that I'm on the East Coast, because for whatever reason, my time zone was set to New York, says, okay, 9 a.m. Eastern, that means 6 a.m. 6 a.m. Los Angeles. And to complicate things further, and this is going down a really deep rabbit hole, but I think it goes to show like where some of this complexity comes in. To complicate things further, if you output things in Twig using the date formatter rather than interpreting the time zone, it interprets it as GMT. So what ended up happening for that client is if I created the event for them at 9 a.m. Eastern, it ended up actually being 4 a.m. GMT, which for whatever reason would get interpreted as whatever 4 a.m. GMT is for Los Angeles time. So it
also known as Pacific time.
Yeah.
Just throwing that in there.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of layers of how even like, never mind the date part, just the time part of the date is complex.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say that adding time zone support into Smart Date almost exponentially expanded the complexity of solving some of the, other use cases that it's meant to address.
Yeah, it's funny because time zones are super complex, and I have been talking to people all over the world over the past couple of months. And I think like last week or maybe, I think it was last week, I was talking to somebody and the time there was like, not like an hour different or a half an hour different. It was like, like 6 hours plus 15 minutes difference. And I was kind of like, wait, what? Like, so it's 11:30 here, but it's like, 9:15 there or 9:45 there. I'm like, what? It completely blew my mind. So Nick, your point about like time zones and them being weird is very accurate. And I think, we also, consider like we're in daylight savings time. We just talked about that, but like Arizona in the United States, doesn't observe daylight savings time ever. So like sometimes they're 3 hours different. Sometimes they're 2 hours different
from the East Coast. Yeah, I mean, I would personally say, I'd love to see daylight savings just abolished as an institution. Personally,
oh boy, let's put a pin in that conversation.
Let's not talk about that on this podcast. So I'm curious. I guess this is kind of the base question that we usually ask, as John alluded to, and what is Smart Date and how does it solve this problem?
So at its core, Smart Date is really a new kind of field, and then it provides its own sort of widgets and formatters in terms of optimizing the output. I would say that a lot of the individual capabilities that Smart Date tries to provide, there are probably other Drupal modules that offer some of the same things. So I know like Daytime Extras is another module that some very smart people put a lot of work into. There are a variety of smaller modules that have individual capabilities, that some of which are sort of also in Smart Date. But I also think that there's value in having sort of a single drop-in solution that creates that kind of a very intuitive experience for editors, and then makes it really easy for them to just focus on the information as opposed to sort of trying to wrangle with the complexities of the interface and then getting them to output as expected.
So what inspired like your love of dates and wanting to create a smart date module?
So really the original inspiration for Smart Date goes back to many years ago. I was working on a website for a local fall fair and basically eating my own dog food. So doing some data entry of events and realizing that every event was actually really tedious to get created using sort of, your standard two field thing where you're tabbing through and putting in each data point. And when you start to think about year, month, day, hour, minute, seconds, and then AM, PM, that gets to be basically 7 data points for each field. And so you're actually having to either manually populate or in some cases zero out, 14 different data points to be able to get a single event created. And so I was thinking about what are some of the things that calendar applications do to make that process so much simpler. And I got thinking about how one of the key concepts is having duration as sort of an assumed value. And so being able to say, rather than assuming that we have to sort of manually populate each of those fields, if we can say, let's assume a duration of an hour, automatically you can reduce that by half. So now you're talking about 7. And then the other thing that a lot of calendar applications will do is rather than default to sort of like now or like now plus an hour or something like that, they'll actually default to the next hour, so that a lot of those data points, because usually you're not scheduling a meeting to start at 11:45 and 23 seconds, you're starting it at noon or 1 p.m. or 1:30. And so by providing that concept of duration as well as a more natural kind of starting point, right away, you can probably schedule most meetings using that kind of an intelligent widget in maybe 3 data points instead of 14.
Right. So you're basically using that information to make the next steps easier, right? So like, does that work the same way for something like multi-day versus a single day event where it's like, hey, like there's a checkbox or something that says, hey, this is a multi-day event, and then opens up the like end date or date range field?
Absolutely. So again, that's a pretty common kind of functionality, is to have that all day checkbox. And so that was another thing that was targeted early on as something that should really be part of this interface, again, to sort of align it with the kinds of tools people are using on a daily basis for, scheduling meetings and sort of, non-Drupal event creation. So yes, you have that checkbox. And then once you check that, then the time fields disappear. And then you have sort of a start and end range for your dates.
Got it. Now, sorry, Nick, I have one other question that just came to mind. Can you set time ranges for the days? So like, and maybe this is not a current feature, but could be a feature down the road. Like where you have like a multi-day event and it goes from like 9 to 5 each day or something like that.
It's definitely something I've given some consideration to, as well as for something like, let's say, a camp, to say, the earliest something could be is, the Wednesday at 9 a.m. that the camp starts. And then the latest any event could be within that is, let's say, 8 p.m. on the day that it ends. So being able to build in some of those controls is definitely something I'd be interested in implementing, but is for now on the roadmap, I would say.
That's fair.
So I'm just kind of thinking back to the first time I did any type of programming that heavily involved dates. And it was actually a project that I worked on slightly with John and Steven. And it involved the need to like notify people that an event was starting in their time zone. And I remember like just spending some time like just staring at my screen, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. And I'm curious, and that was just for one project. I wasn't having to support people's like broad range of features. I'm curious if, you've run into any situations like that when you're, adding functionality to Smart Date or seeing, issues in the issue queue, and how do you break down those issues? Because it sounds like for the top level, you've just gone the route of simplification, but I can't imagine that was really just an easy, like, an easy conclusion to come to. I'm sure there was a lot of, thought that went into that. I'm curious if there's other issues you've run into that really just make you, scratch your head and wonder about the complexity.
Absolutely. And I would say that one of the things that I kind of learned early on is that there's a lot of value in making things configurable as opposed to sort of assuming it should be one way or another, because it seems like invariably if you say, oh, it should always be X way, then, somebody will chime in and say, oh, but I need it, Y and sometimes Z ways. So, to the extent that you can make some of these things more configurable, that definitely seems to help. I suppose sometimes the trade-off there can be complexity in terms of really understanding where all the places are that you can sort of dig into the various configuration options and access some of those. The other thing too is sometimes people will create an issue and say, hey, I have this very specific way I need something to work. And sometimes for me, the best answer is to say, what you want is probably not something that I'm going to support out of the box, but here's how you would make a custom widget to make it work that way. Because I think for those very narrow specific use cases, totally valid for that site and what they're trying to do. But if it's not something that I think is going to be useful for a broader set of people, then a lot of times I'll sort of try and help them along to getting that custom solution built out.
So just out of curiosity, you raise a point there as far as smart date goes, right? Is it using underlying like Drupal core date storage and formatting functionality? It's basically just and I don't mean to oversimplify it here, but it's basically just a like usability improvement on top of like the default date formatting in Drupal.
Yes and no. So at its core, it's actually using core timestamps as the primary storage mechanism. I did that because around the same time I started working on Smart Date, I was auditing a site that I was getting ready to launch. And when I ran a scanner, I think I was using Screaming Frog to sort of look at, accessibility issues as well as if there were any performance areas. The page on the site that by far was the slowest to render was actually an event archive page that maybe had one or two events in it. And so I was sort of scratching my head of, why would this one page take so much longer than anything else? And when I went in to troubleshoot the query and had it show me the SQL statement, it was basically taking each of those date values and for each row doing conversions of values into native date time elements that it could then use for comparison. So there was no possibility of having sort of indexing or any of the other things that would make for kind of an efficient database query. And so that when I saw that, I realized, there's probably a need for, not only the usability improvement, but also to be able to have something that would give some performance improvements as well. And then the other thing as well is that by going a slightly more custom route, I mean, in terms of how the actual sort of storage is fired and all of those things, again, I'm really relying as much as possible on capabilities built into core in terms of converting to and from timestamps. But also by having sort of that custom field type, it's enabled me to do some other things in terms of expanding the capabilities for things like recurring events.
So you mentioned a little bit earlier that sometimes the community will come up with use cases or feature requests, and sometimes you'll make something configurable. Sometimes you'll share with them how to either make their own contrib module or add something on top of Smart Date. Can you talk a little bit more about how the community has helped kind of shape the evolution of Smart Date?
Absolutely. I would say that probably my original Smart Date vision was fairly, I don't want to say simple, but there was really sort of those three core ideas of having the usability improvement, having better formatting of date and time ranges, and then also the performance aspect. But some people came along in sort of the history of me working on Smart Date that really helped, I think, shape some of the additional features that it took on. So Paul Driver of Drupal Yorkshire was one of the people who was really vocal in the issue queue early on, asking for things like calendar integration. I think he was the one who originally suggested recurring events and has also really helped with even just testing and feedback on a bunch of other issues. there is a developer out of Germany called Stefan Korn, who did some amazing work in terms of the full calendar view integration to give it really interactive features within the calendar. So you can drag and drop events to reschedule them. You can actually drag to change the duration of them. Some of these other capabilities that probably, if it was just up to me, I probably would have never gotten around to implementing. So it was amazing that he had a project that needed those capabilities and was able to contribute those to the module. More recently, I've been working pretty closely with one of the maintainers of that full calendar view module to work on some more sort of technically in the weeds issues around calendar integration, specifically around things like time zones and trying to match some of those different use cases.
So that's super interesting. So like the fact that the community has kind of like shown up basically, right, to support smart dates and support your efforts there. I'm just curious, have you had either run into core date issues, or have you helped to try to tackle some of the core date issues?
So there is an issue around filtering with granularity. That is an issue against core. I'm hoping that when we can get that core issue fixed, that will allow that same granularity date picker to be also used for smart date. And so I'm hopeful that I can help to move that along. I've taken a couple of runs at it, but it's a fairly technically dense issue that's got at this point hundreds of issues. We've all seen those ones that have been sort of hanging around core for years. So for that one, as an example, I may sort of resolve myself to doing a smart date specific implementation of the suggested fix. There's a patch in there that seems to work for most use cases, but I have a feeling that daylight savings time may be part of the culprit of why the tests sometimes fail and why it's hard to get that one sort of committed into core. So definitely I'm interested in trying to help get better date handling within core. Would love to see some of the ideas around a simplified widget, better output formatting, some of those things into core as well. At this point, so far I haven't necessarily seen exactly what the best route is to achieve some of those ideas, but would definitely be interested in being part of those discussions if there's any way I could help those along.
Awesome. So let's talk more about other key features of smart dates. I'm really interested in reoccurring events and how you're handling those. I think in the past, I've used the reoccurring module. I don't remember the actual name. It was back in Drupal 7, but I'm interested to hear how you're handling those with smart date.
So there's at least a couple of, I would say, major alternatives in terms of working with recurring dates in Drupal. So probably the big one that most people have used is its machine name is sort of date recur. I think they call it recurring dates field. And then the other one is the recurring events module that I think there was a show about a while back.
Yeah, I was going to
So the date recur module is different from how smart date handles it because it stores the sort of R rule syntax, which is sort of a ISO implementation for how to define recurring dates. It takes that and basically makes that the field value that's directly attached to your entity, your node or what have you. And then it has a way of getting the instances that are generated from that rule as something that you can then sort of query as like related entities, essentially. So recurring events actually works with its own custom entities. So it's not really like a field that you attach to like your node, something like that. It's sort of, its own sort of self-contained ecosystem that way. And really what Smart Date tried to do was to take a very pragmatic approach. So with Smart Date, when you go into your, let's say your event node form and you create a recurring event, it actually takes the rule information and stores that in a related entity and then generates all of those instances and stores those as field deltas. And the benefit of that approach is that when you're creating a view, you can easily create a view that's a mixture of recurring and non-recurring events without having to do some kind of complicated join because, some data is going to be directly on the node and some is going to be off in this relationship and some sort of somehow trying to filter those all together.
So that brings up for me, have you had discussions with other date module or event module maintainers like Owen, who is the creator of the recurring events module? And or maybe I should word that, is there a date related module support group out there?
So there is a date time event Drupal Slack channel. And, there's been lots of good discussions in there. For a while, we were trying to get sort of a community group to meet on sort of a regular basis. But again, part of the challenge was that everybody was in different time zones. There's some super active folks in Australia and some who are in Europe. And so trying to coordinate even asynchronously sometimes was difficult to sort of keep the engagement up. I definitely have had discussions with other maintainers, specifically Owen Bush. And one of the things that we've been able to figure out is that you can actually use Smart Date with, particularly, let's say it's widget or it's output formatting with some parts of the recurring events module, because it uses sort of core date fields internally. And actually you can use the Smart Date widget and core formatter with those core date fields. So there's definitely the opportunity to use those together. I did actually, before starting recurring events in Smart Date, reach out to the date recur module to see if there's a way to get Smart Date to work with that instead of trying to implement something custom. But at the time, it didn't seem like there was really a path forward there. And so that's why I went ahead and tried to get something implemented that would make it easy out of the box to sort of, spin up an event system, but then also to easily add in that additional capability without sort of having to rebuild it specifically for being able to support recurring events.
So as far as other key features, anything else that's worth mentioning with Smart Dates?
So one of the things that I've been actually working on fairly recently is there's actually a formatter specifically for recurring events, and getting some functionality built into there that actually supports not just recurring events, but really any sort of multi-value date field that you have. And the idea being that it can show, let's say, instead of just showing the list of different dates, to be able to say, here's the next one. Here's maybe the most recent one, how many, the 3 next ones that are going to happen, having some different controls there, trying to build in some different twig value support so that, again, because lots of people have different ideas about how that should look and what data should be included, and really trying to make sort of twig variables available so that somebody can just create their own twig template to override the Smart Date one, and then sort of go to town in terms of really making it exactly what they need.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty relevant use case that I've come across in the past. I remember working with a hospital system in I think it was actually Drupal 7 at this point, but they had reoccurring events, sort of. So it was like a reoccurring event, but then there could be like off schedule events, and then they wanted to show all of the future, like here are the next 5 events, and so like that definitely is a use case for folks.
Exceptions like holidays, like hey, we're every Thursday except for Thanksgiving.
So it's like, hey, where you have to like remove a reoccurrence, right, or like change a reoccurrence, like, oh, we're meeting on Tuesday instead of Thursday this week or something like that. So
yeah, and those are the kinds of examples where having those in an interactive calendar makes it really super easy to just sort of like drag that from one day to another. I would say in my own experience, I feel like that calendar view is actually more useful as an interactive way to easily manage those instances than it really is as sort of a end user presentation of that data.
Yeah, definitely.
So you've already mentioned some kind of key differences between how Smart Date manages recurring events or recurring dates than other modules. For example, recurring events stores them as custom entities, and you store them as deltas on the date field. I'm curious if there are any other kind of key differences between how Smart Date handles it and other modules handle kind of that recurring aspect.
So talking specifically about recurring events, I mean, I guess right now, the biggest difference between Smart Date and the recurring events module is really that registration piece. And I know Owen has done quite a lot of work to get that, as a robust solution for allowing registration. And that's, I would say, definitely something that in a perfect world, I would like to see part of what I consider to be sort of that broader Smart Date ecosystem of really trying to make available the full set of capabilities that we know are common use cases around handling events and as you say, recurring events. So I did at one point create sort of a proof of concept of using Smart Date as a field on Drupal Commerce products. So effectively the event becomes a product. And then I think in the proof of concept implementation I did, it was actually using the dates as variations so that you could have essentially like a workshop series as an example, and then register for individual ones.
Okay.
So, I mean, the benefit there being that you can do not only registration, but potentially paid registration, all within sort of, Drupal contained ecosystem, as opposed to, sending somebody off to an Eventbrite, something like that. I have also looked at, I know the RNG module is one that in Drupal 7 could do some pretty sophisticated things around registration. I know there's been, I think, a long, set of work underway around getting that ready for sort of Drupal 8 and 9. And I believe there's a new module maintainer on board. So hopefully we'll see some capabilities there and we'll be able to get that integrated with Smart Date. And another one that someone had pointed out to me was the ticket module in Drupal 7, which has a really slick sort of registration interface. So I'm hoping that, that registration piece is definitely something that we can sort of get plugged in and get, I would say to me, that's probably the biggest hole around the recurring event sort of capability, or just, event management in general. Yeah, I would say right now that's probably the biggest difference.
And you said is that the RNG module, the events and registrations?
Correct. Yes.
I went down the rabbit hole of looking at the RNG and ticket modules while we were talking here, and ticket looks like it's Drupal 7 only right now. So maybe there's a newer improved version in the works there.
Yeah, there's definitely some work that's been done in a dev branch, but it would be great to see that, even as an alpha release, I feel like would start to get more momentum.
Yeah, I think these are some of those. I mean, ticket, I think, was originally created for the COD distribution for like Drupal events, which I think is still Drupal 7 only, which is probably why it hasn't been moved over.
I could, as a bit of a tangent there as well, mention that I've been working with Colleen Clarkson and Mike Herschel around working on a sort of Drupal 9 native solution that would be almost like a newer way to solve some of the same needs that COD distribution was originally created to help address.
If Kaleem listens to this, he's going to get upset with me because I didn't bring that up. Yes, the event organizers working group has an initiative to build a kind of an events platform, an events distribution, I think is what they're going for camps to be able to use some of these great tools that exist, like Smart Dates and registration and that sort of thing, to make it easier for camp organizers to get a site up and running. So yes, he is working on that, and I'm glad to hear that Mike is helping him. That's awesome. There are a couple other people. I think JD Leonard is working on that as well. So if you're interested, go to the event organizers working group page and you can find out more. They have monthly meetings, I think, about that.
And there is actually an alpha release of the event platform if anybody wants to try it out.
There you go. So I am sold on Smart Dates, but if I've listened to this podcast and I'm new to Smart Dates and I want to get started with it, what should I do, or what's the best way for me to do that?
So a good way to get started is using actually sort of a companion module that I made called the Smart Date Calendar Kit. And by installing that one module via Composer, it's going to pull in a bunch of different dependencies, including Smart Date and full calendar view. It's going to give you an event content type out of the box. It's going to give you some views that do things like, being able to aggregate, recurring and upcoming events that are multi-valued. And so it does some fairly sophisticated things out of the box, gives you some best practices that would probably, again, take some deeper knowledge of the module and the best ways to set it up. And then the great thing is using a tool like Simply Test Me, you can essentially try that out in one click. So I know there's a link on the Smart Date module page, but we can add that into the show notes as well.
So the Smart Date calendar kit, if I were just coming in and I needed like a pretty simple like event, calendar view sort of thing, that seems like a good first step for me to kind of get that, put it into my project, and maybe that's a stepping stone into something more complex.
Yeah, absolutely. So it'll give you, again, some best practices out of the box. I would say it's better if you haven't already sort of started down the path. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not terrible if let's say the event content type that you've already started, you're not really happy with how it's working. It's not a lot of work to just sort of, delete that and install this fresh. But, if there is an existing event content type, then it'll basically throw an error and say, we don't like you.
Yeah.
Well, is it meant to be used on a production site, or is it meant to be just kind of used in a prototype to test and figure out yourself?
So really, it could be either. So I've used it before on projects where it becomes sort of the starting point that has a lot of, common use cases already, built into work for. So you can basically install that and then add, whatever additional, entity references or other fields that you need to address the specifics of your particular site. Really, once you've installed it, you can probably uninstall it, because really all it does is it imports a bunch of configuration in terms of, the content type, the views, and some of those other pieces.
Okay. Makes sense.
I see. That's super, super cool. That's exciting.
So continuing in the same vein as John's question, getting started, and probably the piece that I'm more interested in personally, let's say I have an existing site that uses dates and has a few different event types and wants to start getting the benefits of Smart Date. What's the best way to start using it on a site that already has a bunch of content, data, and structure around events?
So there are definitely parts of Smart Date that will work with your core date fields. So you can use the widget and the output formatter that does some of the deduplication of things like, month and year for, ranges that are within, let's say, the same month and year. Some of those kinds of things, you can use those with your core date fields. And so that becomes a fairly easy way to just sort of try it out and get a sense of, how much is this making the experience of managing dates easier, improving the display and some of those other kinds of things. That said, by using it with the core date fields, you're losing the ability to do some of the more sophisticated things like work with recurring events. And so if at a certain point you decide that, you're really happy with how it's working and how that those capabilities are integrating with your site, there is also a drush command you can use to effectively migrate the data from a core date field into a Smart Date field.
Okay. And that's just a data migration, or does it use the Migrate API to?
So it's really just a drush command. It'll go through, you provide all of the parameters in terms of which field it should put data into, and then one or more fields that it's taking data from. So because some sites may be using 2 individual fields, they might be using a date range field, they might, only just have one field and, assume everything is all day. There's a variety of different ways you can sort of configure that drush command to be able to map, one or more existing values into a Smart Date field, which is technically always a range, but you have the ability to sort of, make it an all-day event or a zero duration event. There's a lot of kind of flexibility in that.
Very cool.
So one of the great superpowers of Drupal, right, is interoperability and the ability for modules to work with other modules. I'm curious, what other modules can Smart Date work with?
So as we already touched on the full calendar view integration, and I would say that's probably the most commonly used one, but Smart Date really has integration with a variety of other modules. So, feeds, token, content sync, diff. There's really sort of a wide and growing list of different modules, but as we mentioned before with recurring events, also really anything that is using core date fields under the hood in sort of a configurable way can probably also use Smart Date to some degree.
Wait, there's a Drupal 8 version of feeds now? I haven't used feeds.
There's I'm using Drupal. I'm using feeds on my Drupal 9 site.
Really? I haven't used feeds in years.
Let's try to focus. Okay. We're talking about dates, not feeds. That's a whole different show.
This is a nostalgia show. Like we've mentioned ticket, we've mentioned feeds. These are all, blast from the past modules. So I'm curious about, as John mentioned, Smart Date works with other modules. I'm curious, as a module maintainer, is that something that you have to do intentionally? Or are some of these, if you're using the NT API, for example, they just kind of work out of the box, or is it a mix?
Definitely a mix, I would say. And to some degree, there have been happy instances where I've heard about some module. I think there's one that's linked on the Smart Date module, the multiple fields remove button, which when I heard about it, I was like, this is ideal and something that would be awesome to have work with Smart Date. And then when I actually looked through their issue queue, somebody had already opened an issue, somebody else submitted a patch, and it had already been merged in. So that was sort of already done, and I didn't have to do anything, which was, oftentimes the best case scenario. I've had similar things happen within the Smart Date issue queue where somebody will say, I think feeds is a good example where I personally hadn't run into a use case where I needed that integration, but somebody who did need to use that, opened up the issue, somebody else submitted a patch, and someone else sort of tested that and marked it as RTBC. So I could go in, do a little testing to make sure that it didn't sort of introduce any kind of other, regressions or issues. And effectively that gets merged in. And now, anybody who wants to use that module with feeds has that capability available out of the box.
So I was going to ask this question a little later, but this might be a good place to introduce it. I'm curious about that kind of, again, as a module maintainer, I'm curious about that perspective, because obviously it sounds like you're happy to do a little testing, get some more support in there, especially if somebody else has already put in the work. But I'm curious about the thought process about when to do that and when to kind of push something off, because they kind of did this integration, but let's say something you update later breaks feeds integration. I imagine implicitly, if you're merging something in, you're kind of agreeing to support it longer term. Is that something that you consider, or is that something that you're just like, hey, if it breaks, they'll probably introduce a patch and work with you, or do you just take any and all patches that add functionality? I'm kind of curious how you think about that.
It's definitely a dilemma sometimes, I would say, for sure. I mean, I feel like something like feeds that, has such broad usage and can really be used for a variety of different use cases. That one is easier to sort of lean towards adoption and kind of, particularly when you've got a patch that's RTBC. Sometimes if it's more of a narrower use case, it's particularly if it's not clear that it's something that would be of use to a lot of people, then, I'll have to think that through. To some degree, it may also be a question of what's required to sort of add that. So oftentimes I find, especially in sort of Drupal 8 and 9, the nice thing is that these kinds of integrations that we're talking about is really about adding some kind of a class to, the overall code base, as opposed to sort of, injecting some kind of like a hook or other call within an existing set of code. And so it's fairly self-contained. And as you say, maybe it's going to need some care and feeding over time, but probably the people who use that and rely on it are going to catch when, let's say the new version of feeds comes out and that API has changed. And so that code needs to be updated. Those are the folks who are using it are probably going to catch it and I would say likely submit a patch, but at a minimum, at that point you can sort of track it down, but it's not likely to create any kinds of issues in, other parts of how Smart Date works.
Makes sense. So moving on a bit, I'm curious about what are some of the more complex use cases you've seen people utilize Smart Date to address?
So as I started going to kind of different camps and talking about Smart Date and some of the capabilities that it has, people have asked questions around, can it address things like, let's say, the ability to add events to calendar, or to be able to have, let's say, if you've got a monthly meetup, to be able to have, a different agenda and speaker each month. And so I started trying to think about what are some ways to address some of those more complicated use cases. And to be honest, it was also around the same time that I was having more discussions with other folks within sort of the Drupal date time community, that I started thinking about, is there a way to address some of those in a way that isn't specific to Smart Date, something that could be, leveraged by lots of different modules. And one of the things that I was thinking about is also the way some modules that exist to do things like add to calendar functionality really use that by implementing a new date formatter. And the challenge that creates is that you have to essentially choose either the add to calendar functionality, or the smarter sort of, range deduplication and other capabilities, but it's sort of like all one or the other. And so I created this Date Augmenter API as a way to sort of be able to have a collection of plugins that a site builder can use to sort of put together the set of capabilities that they need. So you can have, the date range deduplication in the output, as well as add to calendar, as well as have, different content per sort of date instance, some of those other kinds of things. And as I say, the API is well documented. So any other modules that want to be able to implement that API and take advantage of those extra capabilities, have that flexibility as well.
So
Interesting.
I think we ask this quite frequently, and I'm going to preface it with Uncle Ben from Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. So Smart Date sounds great, but when should Smart Date not be used? Or are there any instances?
I mean, I'm definitely biased in favor of saying that, whenever I need to manage dates, I'm probably leaning towards using Smart Date. Sure. I will say sometimes I've seen people do things where they're really just wanting to store, let's say, years, right? So it's sort of like, let's say it's an employment history and they want to store like, so-and-so worked at this company from, 2005 to 2012. Is that a really good use case for Smart Date? Not really. There are times where if somebody wants just dates and particularly if they don't need anything, extra fancy around sort of output formatting or some of those other things, maybe just using a core date time field that's set to date only, may give them exactly what they need in a way that's simpler to set up, perhaps. So it's definitely not. I don't want to be sort of the guy with a hammer who thinks every problem looks like a nail, but I've tried to make it flexible enough that outside of some of those really simple use cases, I feel like it can be a lot of different situations.
So as you are right now our resident date expert, I have you just made me think of another question here. So say I need I need to tag something with just a month or just a year, right? Reasonable to use a taxonomy, or should I always use a date field in some way, shape, or form?
It's a hard one to sort of say categorically. As an example, the event platform that we mentioned earlier, one of the things that implementation actually does is it uses a date field on a taxonomy term as the way to categorize those. So, again, with Drupal, so often, the right way to handle things, there's so many different ways to do it that
sure,
without understanding, more specifics around what you're trying to do, it's so hard to say.
I was going to make a joke about using a taxonomy that has a date field on it, just tongue in cheek, but it sounds like that's the way you actually solved that problem in the past. So,
well,
but,
I mean,
but you're right.
Yeah, I was going to say some of the issues that are in the smart date issue queue that are a little bit trickier to troubleshoot are ones that people are using in ways that I hadn't really thought of. So, smart date inside a paragraph with a media field as well, or smart date fields on media. But then I think there's an issue around if you have that combination, then in the media library modal, sometimes it does some funny things. And yeah, so there are definitely ways that people are using it that I wouldn't have thought of, but that's not to say they're not valid. It's just sometimes that creates the need for some additional troubleshooting.
I feel like we're coming full circle here. I'd just like to remind our listeners that my first question were, why are dates in Drupal or dates in general so complex? And I think this is a whole show just validating that point.
So do you have a roadmap for Smart Date? Do you have a current plan for the future? What are you working on now?
So, one of the things that I try and keep up to date on is really just the overall issue queue, and sort of, as bug reports trickle in and other things come up, particularly trying to make sure that bug reports get dealt with as quickly as possible. If there are sort of, small and easy to address feature requests, trying to get those in. I would say one of the priorities that I'm definitely keeping top of mind is Drupal 10 compatibility. I think probably right around as soon as they tag a beta release of Drupal 10, I'll try and get that added. Right now, it looks like it just needs the info.yaml to be Drupal 10 compatible. So, that's definitely high priority, I would say. There is in the issue queue a version 4 plan issue that has some specific issues I'd like to see kind of in the next major version. There's a library that Smart Date uses to sort of generate all of those instances based on what the user has configured for, let's say, a recurring event. And so, making sure that that's up to date with the modern version. A few other things in terms of making Smart Date easier to work with from a migration standpoint. We talked about the full calendar view integration as I think, one of the key features of Smart Date is that calendar integration. But I know there are also people who like to use the calendar module, which I think got new maintainers, I want to say about a year and a half ago, and it's starting to get some more momentum. So, those kinds of, I would say, as much as possible, leveraging, core APIs, integrations with other modules. Those are definitely some things that are kind of always top of mind for me.
So this is a question that we've asked probably most module maintainers that we've had on the show, but I'm curious, personally, how do you prioritize or triage tickets in the queue? You mentioned you try to address bug reports very quickly, but do you look at the issue queue weekly, daily, and how do you decide, what's something you need to address right away versus something that might go in the backlog?
So I will say that oftentimes what I will try and do is, if I can, obviously we have days where we're just, absolutely underwater with things to do, and it's hard to get to something right away. But usually if I can, I'll at least respond to a bug report to sort of ask any clarifying questions. So to say, what version of the module are you using, what version of core, some of those other kinds of things, because if someone is describing behavior that seems at odds with, the way I've used the module a bunch of times already, then it feels like there must be some more detailed steps to reproduce that are going to be needed before I can even help to work on that. Beyond that, I would say a lot of times it's really around sort of a combination of, severity. So if it's, I got a white screen of death, then obviously that's a different level of, urgency than something that's like, well, I got this PHP error notice that shows up in my server log, or, this one character looks funny or something, right? So trying to sort of I guess weave in that level of, what's the impact to affected sites. And then sometimes too, if it's a very sort of strange edge case, then I'm definitely not going to sort of say, well, you're on your own, but that's different than, as soon as I install the module, my site breaks, right? So
Makes sense.
Did you try turning it off and turning it back on?
That's right. Yeah, I think the Drupal equivalent is, have you tried clearing the caches?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a question kind of out of left field that I'm curious if it's something you've ever heard of or plan on supporting. So we've spent a lot of time talking about time zones and how complex they are and how complex states in general are. But maybe 2 weeks ago, I learned that there's also significantly different calendars around the world as well. So, for example, I think in Thailand, they're near like 5,000 something. I know that China has a different year. I'm sure that there's, the lunar calendars, for example, that are different. Have you ever seen discussion or thought of supporting other calendaring systems than kind of the general one that most people are used to, where we're in 2022?
Yeah, I mean, and so this is an example of why working on smart data is so fascinating, is because people are always throwing this like, have you ever thought of, this thing that is it, to me, like a really interesting use case. Definitely not something that I've considered. I would say that because smart date stores its date and time values as timestamps since the last Unix epoch, then it definitely should be possible to get it to work. But probably if I had to do that, I would be relying on some kind of existing PHP library that would do the conversion into those different calendars, those kinds of things. I feel like it's probably it might be something you could even manage with the existing widget, but then use a different formatter to output it in, according to the Chinese calendar, or I think Ethiopia is another one that has a different calendar. So it definitely should be possible, but, until I had somebody who actually said, hey, I actually need this functionality. And, ideally, if somebody in that issue was to say, here's an example of that being implemented well, or, as I say, even if there was an existing library, then that would definitely make life easier in terms of getting that implemented.
Okay. And before we move on, I just want to clarify that it's not your 5,000 in Thailand. Thailand has a 543-year difference from the Gregorian calendar. So it's actually 2565, I think.
2561 is what I'm seeing here based on Wikipedia, and I'm going to put a link in the show notes for our listeners, because I looked that up and it's pretty interesting. Apparently, Thailand uses the Buddhist calendar, which has a different epochal date or year zero. And that is, yes, Nick, you are correct, 543 years ahead of the Gregorian calendar.
Yeah.
So,
which is 2565. I think Google cached the Wikipedia result from a few years ago, because Google says 2561.
Yeah, you are right. Because then in the last line it says 2565. Yep. I apologize. You clearly can do math better than I can. Yes, I will.
No, I just read the whole response, the whole search result. But yeah, so to your point, Martin, this is the kind of thing that I find infinitely fascinating. But I just want to say I'm very happy there are people like you that take this on, because like I said, ever since that first time that I implemented like a time-sensitive notification system that spanned multiple time zones and started learning about like as a developer, they give me nightmares sometimes. So I'm always happy when another developer kind of takes up the mantle. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that or making that a feature request, an official feature request to support all these calendars. But I just want to thank you for, helping out on making it a better UI for the Drupal community. I'm certainly going to be looking into Smart Date for those clients, because it sounds like it's a perfect fit. This client has weekly events at the, virtual events, every Thursday at 7 p.m. for 6 weeks, and then they reevaluate. So it sounds like this will be a much needed improvement for them.
So let's ask the question, right? If somebody felt like they wanted to add another type of calendar to smart dates, or they wanted to help with smart dates in some other way, how could somebody do that?
So a really easy place to get started is obviously in the issue queue. So even when creating an issue, I would say, the more that people have the detailed steps to reproduce, screenshots are always helpful in terms of saying, either this is how it's broken when I try to do X, or even, I've seen people where they'll actually do a bit of a mock-up of like, wouldn't it be better if the UI looked like this? The more sort of detail and care that people can put into issue creation is a big help. Having people who will go in and write patches is obviously, invaluable as a maintainer to have somebody doing some of that work, and even people who are willing to go in and test those existing patches and say, either that is great, make it RTBC, or even provide feedback to say, this is great, but there were these couple of issues or it threw these other warnings, so let's try and get those resolved. All of that is tremendously helpful. So, as much as I would love to have people who can constantly be going in and writing patches, obviously that's amazing. But I've even had people who have been willing to do things like write documentation in terms of like migrating into a smart date field. Here's how that can look. So there's really a broad spectrum of different ways people can help.
So before we move on to the show close, I did have one question that I wanted to turn back to. So you mentioned that one of your priorities is Drupal 10. And we've given a couple of updates inspired by you for Drupal 10 over the last few weeks. I'm curious about, as a module maintainer, what's out there for Drupal 10? Because there's every major version, there's been a really big push. And I know Drupal 9, for example, was a Drupal Rector bot was created that kind of posted suggested patches for getting you to Drupal 9 readiness. And I know a lot of that tooling is still around, but it just feels like there's been less fanfare, I guess you would say. And I'm curious if that's because a lot of the move from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 was fairly smooth. I'm curious if that's because the same thing is happening for Drupal 10, and if those tools, just because they already exist, are more available to you. Or is there going to be a scramble when Drupal 10 comes out? People are going to be like, oh my God, I completely forgot. We need to update everything now.
So I think there will be a similar push in terms of saying, okay, we've got whatever the Drupal 10 beta 1. Now let's sort of kind of get all of those contrib authors to marshal their resources. I haven't seen any of those issues being generated automatically, like you described, which definitely was a huge help in going from 8 to 9. I suspect that it's probably more a case that there's still active work underway in terms of getting some of those deprecated APIs removed. And so it's probably more contingent on that work. And once it's complete, then they'll probably start to move on to that next phase of letting all of the different module maintainers know what are the specific things that they need to do to be fully Drupal 10 ready. But I expect that that's coming.
Okay.
And just as an update, I think the last stat that I heard was that they figured it was about 75% complete in terms of getting some of those deprecated APIs removed. So it's definitely making good progress.
Okay. Okay. Before we close out, is there anything else that you would like to let our listeners know or mention?
I guess just to mention again about the date time Slack channel, definitely available in there if people have questions and have particular ways that they want to use Smart Date, in addition to sort of filing issues and support requests and so on.
Well, Martin, thank you for joining us for the last 4 weeks. It's been great, and we look forward to future updates about Smart Date.
Do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack and the Talking Drupal channel. And if you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, Chad's Book Corner, and Abby's bi-weekly game review, you can sign up for a newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing Become a Patron.
All right. As we bring the show in for a landing here, Martin, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, how would they go about doing that?
On Drupal.org, the Drupal Slack, and various social platforms, they can find me as Mandclue.
Awesome. Nick, what about you?
You can find me online at NixVan, NICXV, and pretty much everywhere.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, and on Drupal.org at John Picozzi as well. And if you are looking for a job, EPAM is hiring. So you can go to epam.com/careers to find out more about that.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes,
Have a good day.
week.